Hi, good morning, and welcome to Boom. It's on the blockchain. My name's Alistair Caithness. It is 10 o'clock here out in California. Had to shut the blinds because there's a bit of a roaster out here. 106 in Fahrenheit yesterday when I lived down in Bonita. So I know the rest of the world's feeling it chilly. Here in Southern California, it's still nice and toasty. So we're just waiting for Grant from Copernic Space to come in. He's just messaged us. So to change things up a little bit this week, we're going to start off with chewing the cud, basically kill a little bit of time. And we're going to talk today about UK politics. So even though we're based in California and everyone in the UK used to think US politics was a bit of a joke when Trump was running things, how the tables have turned. So let me bring in this image that's just about to come in right now. And let me maybe make it a bit bigger. There we go. Look at that. Who is that? Liz Truss. Liz Truss has resigned after 44 days in charge. This article here is what lasts longer, a lettuce or Liz Truss? NBC put it out yesterday, and the NBC were correct. Liz Truss managed to be the shortest prime minister in British history. Congratulations to her. Congratulations to the Conservative government. They are going to put a third unelected prime minister in charge. And people might say, well, there's only been two because Boris actually got the vote. But Theresa May before that was unelected and got in. And in actual fact, John Major after Margaret Thatcher was unelected and got in. So how does that actually work? And why can you create a system where a lettuce is essentially better than your prime minister? Well, the UK never used to be like this. It used to be a bastion of leadership in the world. It created the British Empire, and now we've got lettuces running the country. Well, anyway, the way British politics works is if the party in charge wants to change their leadership, they can actually have an internal vote of a bunch of rich, conservative, wealthy donors to decide who the next prime minister will be. So believe it or not, she was voted in with around about 40,000 votes. Can you believe it? 40,000 votes. That's all it takes to become a prime minister of Britain. And you might think, well, wait a minute, 40,000. That sounds a bit like one of these African banana republic countries. You know, people in the UK would always say that. Our politics aren't like that. But unfortunately, it's actually worse. Yes, they had this internal vote after they got rid of Boris Johnson. It dragged on for months. She looked like she was going to be this new leader to lead the UK out of recession. She had a mini budget. I don't even know why she wanted to do a mini budget before her Tory party conference, and it went down like a lead balloon. She managed to sink the pound to its lowest it's been, I think, in history against the dollar. So she managed to do that within 5 days of coming into office. Wasn't really the best of starts. Then she decides that she's going to start sacking people because it's all their fault. And once she sacked a few people there, including the Chancellor, suddenly they started resigning, other people started resigning, an internal vote of no confidence. And even though she was laughing a couple of days ago when her foreign secretary left, suddenly 2 days later, she's gone as well. Well, history will show that she is definitely the worst prime minister in British history, but who's going to come back in charge? Well, this is where things start to get a little bit weird and a little bit scary. So let's bring him in once again. Here he is, Boris Johnson. Boris is now thrown his hat back in the ring. So he was voted out with a vote of no confidence. Suddenly, yes, that is his actual hair, similar to Donald Trump's, except his is a little bit longer, is now third favourite to be the next Prime Minister of Britain. Can you actually believe that? He is now back, potentially in charge of the country. So how does that actually work? So for people in America, see, Americans are looking at the UK system thinking, wait a minute, We had American independence essentially from rich English people and rich Scottish people at the time 250 years ago. They no longer wanted to be taxed by the King George at the time, didn't want to send taxes back. They wanted to have their own rule. They created their own system to be away from the British. Suddenly, everyone's laughing at US politics. What has happened to US politics? And then suddenly, the UK system is in complete and utter collapse. So, what's actually happened there? Well, Boris Johnson got voted in because of Brexit. Part of the reason was that the UK no longer wanted to have an extra layer of government. I'm not actually disagreeing with that idea, but as part of Brexit, you had to realize that so many of the workers out there were immigrant workers coming into the country. So these were people from Eastern Europe that would come in and do a lot of the jobs in there. All the farm work was coming from Eastern Europe. A lot of the low-paying jobs, like a lot of the immigrants that come into America, they do the jobs that the typical British young people no longer want to do. So suddenly stopping that immigration coming into the country was a bit of a disaster. So next thing you know, we no longer have people wanting to do low-level jobs in the country. So that didn't start well for them. A lot of his policies and promises to the country coming in sort of fell by the wayside. You know, the pandemic came along. Britain being on its own during the pandemic actually worked worse than actually being part of the European Union. So that was another blow to him. All this money that was supposed to be coming back into the NHS, 350 million a day savings that he was about to do and boost the NHS, actually backfired again. So now there's a shortage of nurses in the UK, there's a shortage of doctors in the UK, and there's a shortage of funding in the UK as well. All these things that he had promised that would help, and you had clowns out there like Nigel Farage, who seemed to think it was the greatest, thing that he did in history, but now suddenly a few lies and a few porky pies, and it all goes back the other way. So anyway, he has to leave. They have this vote. Liz Truss comes in. Let's bring it in again. Here's an article about it. Let's see if we can bring it up a little bit bigger. Liz Truss to quit as Prime Minister. Exclusive statement expected shortly after departure of top ministers and evaporation of political authority. And there she is there. They thought she was going to be Margaret Thatcher Mark II. Margaret Thatcher lasted for a number of years. Liz Truss, 44 days. It's total and utter embarrassment for the Conservative government. So how does it actually happen that they will not go forward with a general election in the UK? Now, this is where things get weird for Americans, because Americans usually vote in the president. So unless they're impeached then and thrown out, there's no reason why there's not going to be an election for the next president coming into this country. Whereby in the UK, the way the system works is they're about to have a third prime minister, potentially Big B himself. There he is. Let's bring her back. Let's Truss her cabbage, So if you're looking at the three of them, so suddenly there's a third person going to come in. And right now, that person could be Boris Johnson. So that is absolutely unbelievable. Now, you might think, well, no, that's never going to happen. Why would it not happen? It's his supporters that stuck the knife into her when she came out with our essential policy some of her policies, when you think about it, want to kickstart the economy and they want to reduce taxes and provide tax incentives to business. But ultimately, none of it was to help the poorest people in society. So she came in with this real right-wing policy. And the problem with a lot of right-wing policies is they actually leave behind a lot of the poorest people that are out there in society. So old people in the UK, their heating bills are going through the roof. Now, you might be able to keep blaming Boris Johnson Vladimir Putin of Russia, but ultimately the government doesn't need to tax fuel in the country so high. Where was the tax break on people at home? if you think of taxes being high in fuel in a place like California, taxes on fuel and gasoline in the UK is super high. I think it's like 89 cents for every dollar spent at the gas station is taxes. So why could she not come in, and if she's going to reduce taxes, just give a tax break for the next 4 months for anyone on fuel duty living at home under a certain salary cap, say £30,000? Or essentially provide free access to fuel for the government picking up the tab for all people at home, because people are going to be freezing to death already this year. You've already got horror stories out there where people are out sitting at home. It's cold in the UK. They cannot afford to put their heating on. Essentially, they say inflation in the UK is over 10%, but your fuel inflation in terms of heating your house, etc., it's at 23, 24%. So essentially, people's cost of living has gone up so much. And if you are operating on the breadline and suddenly the heating of your house comes up, you've got to start making some decisions. And what you're going to do, not pay your bill. See, this is where she should have come in there and provided the tax breaks to the poorest people in society, rather than saying, I'm only going to provide the tax breaks to the richest people in the UK society. Why not just do both? That was the problem. Oh, well, I want to kickstart the economy. I want to provide reduce the top rate of tax for the richest people in the UK. Well, they'll still be able to heat their houses over the winter period, even though they live in multi-million-dollar mansions. The problem really being is, if you're a poor person living in an inner city area, you're living on the breadline, suddenly you're budgeting hard, inflation's running at 10, 11%, food inflation's running at 16, 17, 18%. Inflation for meat is 30%. Inflation of fuel duty, 25%. Suddenly it's like that inflation figure they talk about for the poorest people in society isn't the same for the richest people in society. So she absolutely shot herself in the foot, and no one wanted to go with her agenda. There was no need for her to do this mini budget when she came in anyway. She just wanted to make her mark, and it all blew up, and then she sank the pound to the lowest it's ever been. It's actually risen today now. It was nearly 1-on-1 with the dollar, and now it's about $1.13 to the pound, which is still low compared to what it was 10 years ago, but ultimately it's created this position. So why don't they have a general election in the UK right now? Well, ultimately, you start to think about it, is there's absolutely they have to have a general election. How can they put it out to, and this way they're actually not even going to go out to the Tory government in terms of the party members. So you're not even going to go out to the 45,000 rich Tory members who voted her in the first place. You're going to go out to even less people. This is basically following Vladimir Putin's vote. I'm going to have a vote for change the political system in Russia, whereby I can get an additional 4-year term. Who's voting on this? Me. Okay, great. That comes in. Saddam Hussein. We went to war in Iraq based on a dossier of weapons of mass destruction. The Tony Blair signed off on that as well. Let's not just blame George Bush on that. We went there, but prior to that, Saddam Hussein elections used to be, there's only one candidate on the election, Saddam Hussein. And if you don't vote for him, you're in a bit of trouble. So basically it would be, Saddam Hussein's won the election with 99.3% of the vote. Yes, Saddam is back. And then the weird thing is, we went to liberate these people, and we managed to take a lot of oil out of the country as well at the time as well. Up until that point, before the weapons of mass destruction dossier, the entire oil industry in Iraq was essentially a state-run oil industry. It might not be the most efficient, but the oil's right below the ground, and they can produce oil in Iraq at, say, $9, $10 a barrel. After the Iraq war, suddenly it's absolutely flipped on its head. And now the Iraq government and the Iraq government oil companies, essentially they are just pass-through entities, whereby now you have the big oil operators running the country in terms of they're running the big oil fields. You're talking about BP, you're talking about Exxon, you're talking about the PetroChina, you're talking about all the Russian ones as well. Everyone who's actually operating there, the big Norwegian ones, Statoil, they were all in there running the oil operations in the country now, and the Iraqi people get 20% of it. So that was the weapons of mass destruction, and that was actually a Labour government that actually pushed that agenda through as well. But we can sit and talk about these things all day long. But ultimately, if you start to think about it, is how can the UK ultimately not have a general election and then suddenly say the inner people in the country now vote for Boris Johnson? So Boris is actually back. And there's calls for Boris coming back. You know, it's on Twitter already. You've got backbenchers now tweeting it. Bring back Boris. The hashtag is back. Bring back Boris. It's like it was never as bad under Boris. Boris was fired for lying to the country multiple times. You know, if this was America, he would definitely have been impeached. You know, Trump was impeached for way less stuff than this guy. But this guy is now, it's bring back Boris and unelected again. So, well, he got voted in first time. So this is like crazy. And like, they're not going to want to call a general election because ultimately the problem being is, you know, how can you call a general election if you're going to lose? And people think, well, what do you mean they're going to lose? If they went to the public vote right now, it's an absolute landslide for Labour. The Tories will be out. Now, they've been in charge of the UK for a number of years. It's time for them to move out anyway. They're sort of devoid of all ideas that's coming out there. But again, they're going to drag this out. So the way the UK system works is once you're voted in, you've got up to 5 years to call a general election, or you can just time out. So at the very last day of the 5-year period, then you can have another election. It's not like in America, whereby it's just set in stone every 4 years. In the country, the government party can ultimately, how would you say it? They get to choose the timing of the election. So if they feel the timing is right, and normally they don't wait the entire 5 years unless they have to, they want to take advantage of that moment in time. Anyway, that's what's happening now. Boris, bring back Boris. And the scary thing is he's third favourite with the bookies. So it's like, so that's the bookmakers are running odds and who's coming back. Suddenly money is getting pumped on this guy. Now, ultimately, she was so bad. Let's bring her back in again. Let's have a look. That replacing her with a lettuce seems like quite a good idea. Replacing the lettuce with Boris, now you're starting to think there's a potential move afoot here, you know? So it's absolutely and utterly crazy. And that is UK politics right now. Americans, you don't understand it. The UK system, unless they have a general election right now, it's no better than a one-party system that's happening in other countries in the world. It could be this. If you told the world right now that this was happening in Rwanda, we'd be laughing at it. We would say, no, the government's out there, it's so corrupt, it's absolutely ridiculous. Look, inflation at 10, 11%. You know, they're coming in with 40,000 people voting them in. In actual fact, we're going to have maybe, 300 people deciding who the next prime minister is in the country. Oh, great. And of them, it's like who's putting their hand out to get cashback payments. Great as well. If they said that, you would just say, oh, that country, banana republic. You know, that's a racist thing to say anyway. Banana republic. Look at them out there. But this is now the UK running this system. So they have to call a general election. The scary thing is they're not going to do this, you know? And that's ultimately the position that it's in right now, which is unbelievable. So it's like, let's have a last quick look at Boris. There he is, potentially the next prime minister. And we're having a look in terms of Liz Truss. Let's have one last look at her. And now she's going to be in charge for the next foreseeable future until the new prime minister is announced. But you might as well have the lettuce running the country because she's about as useful as